Asterisk Africa needs America. Asterisk. The words fell heavy, not like a statement, but like a decree. The room seemed to tighten around them. Cameras snapped in rapid succession, catching the smirk on Donald Trump's face as he leaned back, arms folded, radiating the certainty of a man who believed he had just delivered undeniable truth. For a heartbeat, silence. No applause. No response. Just the stunned weight of arrogance echoing in the chamber. Journalists shifted in their seats, pens frozen above notepads. Delegates glanced at one another, eyebrows raised, whispers barely suppressed. To some, it was familiar, an echo of the old world order, a reminder of how power often spoke to the powerless. To others, it was shocking even by Trump's standards, a line that cut deeper than politics and struck at centuries of dignity. In that pause, you could almost hear history whisper. Africa, once spoken for, once dismissed, once cast as dependent, now faced the words on a global stage. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing Trump's expression, self-satisfied, unbothered, certain that his declaration would stand unchallenged. But arrogance has a way of creating its own silence. And into that silence, something was stirring. In the back rows, a young figure shifted forward, shoulders squared, eyes burning with quiet resolve. He was not just another leader. He was a symbol of defiance, of a new generation unwilling to bow. The air changed. The crowd sensed it before the first word was spoken. A storm was about to break, not with anger, but with clarity, not with desperation, but with dignity. What happened next would leave the entire hall in disbelief and send shockwaves far beyond its walls. For those who knew the history, Trump's words did not land in isolation. They carried the weight of centuries, echoing the voices of empires that once carved borders with rulers and rifles, dictating futures without consent. It was the familiar tone of the colonial lecture, wrapped now in the swagger of 21st century populism. And for many watching, it was like hearing an old wound torn open. This was not the first time an African leader, or an entire continent, had been reduced to dependency in the eyes of the West. From civilizing missions to development aid, the language has always carried the same message. You are less without us. It was a script written long ago, rehearsed over decades, and repeated by those who held power. But every repetition comes with risk, because every generation listens differently. For the audience in that hall, Trump's declaration felt like history speaking through him. Dismissive, condescending, certain. It wasn't just offensive. It was emblematic of the deeper struggle Africa has faced, the constant framing as a continent in need, rather than a continent with power, ideas, and dignity of its own. And for young Africans watching on screens around the world, it rang especially loud. Many had grown up in nations told to wait, told to depend, told that prosperity could only come when approved by someone else's hand. That is why the silence after his words mattered so much. It wasn't the kind of pause that follows a clever punchline. It was the stillness of a wound recognized by millions. A silence that asked, will anyone answer this? Or will it go unchecked, like so many insults before? Because this wasn't just about one man's arrogance. This was about a story older than the room they were in. It was about generations of leaders who bowed their heads under pressure, about movements crushed before they could breathe, about dignity denied again and again. When Trump said, Africa needs America, he was not just talking to the delegates in front of him. He was talking to every village, every city, every nation that had ever been told they could not stand alone. And yet, something about this moment was different. The world had changed. The continent had changed. New voices were rising, younger, unafraid, unwilling to inherit silence as their legacy. The question was no longer whether Africa needed America. The question was whether America could keep pretending that Africa would never speak back. That's why, when Ibrahim Traoré moved forward, the anticipation was electric. Here was not a career politician polished by Western institutions, but a soldier of his people, carrying the urgency of a generation tired of being lectured to. His presence alone felt like history bending, like a storm about to roll across the stage. And that's exactly why Traoré's answer hit like thunder. Donald J. Trump has always styled himself as larger than life. To his supporters, he is the ultimate deal-maker, the man who puts America first without apology. But to much of the world, and especially to Africa, His persona is the embodiment of something else: brash arrogance, entitlement cloaked as strength, and a worldview that treats nations not as equals, but as clients to be lectured, mocked, or threatened. From the moment he descended that golden escalator in 2015, Trump cultivated an image of raw confidence, the outsider who could say what no one else dared. He sneered at tradition, bulldozed through norms, and reveled in the gasps his words provoked. For his base, this was refreshing. For the rest of the world, it was exhausting and often insulting. His rhetoric carried the energy of a man convinced that America's dominance was not just a fact, but a natural law, one that needed to be enforced with blunt talk and even blunter policy. Nowhere did that arrogance reveal itself more clearly than in his references to Africa. During his presidency, Trump made headlines not for diplomatic vision, but for crude dismissals. Reports surfaced of him calling African nations shithole countries. He reduced entire regions to stereotypes, spoke of disease and chaos, and dismissed leaders' concerns as though they were inconveniences. For Africans watching, it was not just offensive. It was a reminder of how little their dignity mattered to a president who saw the world through a lens of winners and losers. And yet, Trump's contradictions are what made him such a complicated figure. He prided himself on being a champion of strength, a man who respected power above all else. He admired authoritarian leaders abroad, praising their toughness, even as he dismissed democratic allies. But what he failed to see was that true strength is not found in volume, but in restraint. Power is not measured only in wealth or armies, but in the ability to command respect without demanding it. Trump confused intimidation with influence, bluster with authority. That contradiction was on full display whenever he addressed Africa. He saw a continent of resources to be extracted, markets to be tapped, and allies to be courted only if they bowed to American priorities. He rarely, if ever, spoke of Africa as a partner. Instead, he framed it as a project, a place perpetually in need, waiting for America's guiding hand. In his worldview, America was the sun, and Africa, like much of the world, was expected to orbit around it. This was not new. Leaders before him had patronized Africa too, though often with the softer language of development aid or support. But Trump stripped away the diplomatic varnish. His bluntness exposed the raw imbalance beneath the relationship. And that, in many ways, made the insult cut deeper. He wasn't pretending to respect Africa while dismissing it in private. He was saying the quiet part out loud, turning arrogance into a performance for the cameras. For Trump, this was theater. Every insult, every headline, every gasp from the press was proof that he had dominated the stage. He thrived on outrage, feeding off the energy of those he provoked. In his mind, to be shocking was to be strong. And so when he declared, "Africa needs America," he was not merely speaking policy. He was asserting dominance, planting a flag in the ground, reminding the world of who he believed held the upper hand. But in that very performance lay the seeds of his undoing. Because arrogance, while loud, is brittle. It blinds those who wield it to the shifting ground beneath their feet. Trump did not notice that the world he was addressing was no longer the world of the past. He did not see the growing pride among young Africans, the leaders rising who would not accept the old script of dependency. To him, the silence that followed his remark was victory, proof that no one dared to challenge him. What he didn't realize was that silence can also mean something else: the drawing of breath before a storm. Trump had faced critics before, of course. In America, he sparred with journalists, rivals, and even members of his own party. He relished it, using conflict to strengthen his brand. But this stage was different. Here, his words carried the echo of empire, the shadow of history. And across from him sat not another American politician playing the same game, but a man forged in a different fire. A soldier, a revolutionary, a leader with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Trump believed his declaration would stand unchallenged. He believed he had reminded Africa of its supposed place. But arrogance always meets its match. And in this hall, on this day, its match was already rising to speak. Long before his name became a rallying cry across Africa, Ibrahim Traoré was simply a young soldier, a man shaped not by privilege or wealth, but by the daily struggles of his people. Born in Burkina Faso, he grew up in a land marked by hardship and resilience, where the soil is dry, the opportunities few, but the spirit of the people unbreakable. He chose the path of the uniform not for glory, but because he believed service was the truest form of strength. As a soldier, he stood shoulder to shoulder with ordinary men, eating the same food, enduring the same exhaustion, facing the same dangers. His comrades remember him not as a commander barking orders from safety, but as the first to march, the last to rest, and the one who never asked of others what he would not endure himself. This forged a bond of trust, the kind that cannot be bought and cannot be faked. It was in those years that he began to embody something larger than himself, the idea that leadership means sacrifice, not entitlement. When his nation trembled under instability, when old elites failed to deliver security or dignity, Traoré's rise was sudden but not accidental. He was propelled forward by a groundswell of frustration, a people tired of corruption, dependency, and leaders who looked outward for validation instead of inward for strength. In him, they saw not another politician shaped by Western schools or foreign donors, but a son of the soil, unbought, unbowed, and unapologetically Burkinabe. His youth, far from being seen as inexperience, became his weapon. At 34, he represented an entire generation of Africans under 40 who make up the majority of the continent, yet are rarely given the microphone. Where others saw risk, his people saw promise. Where outsiders dismissed him as untested, his supporters hailed him as fearless. He was not there to play the old games of diplomacy. He was there to speak plainly, to demand respect, to embody the dignity his nation deserved. In his speeches, Traoré often chose humility over bravado. He spoke not of personal wealth or fame, but of collective destiny, of the simple truths that bind communities together: land, freedom, dignity, and hope. His philosophy was clear: Burkina Faso's strength did not lie in handouts or in the approval of foreign powers. It lay in the courage of its people to define their own future. This humility was not weakness. It was clarity, and clarity is power. Contrast that with the man who sat across from him in the hall. Trump, gilded by wealth and intoxicated by applause, measured greatness in towers and headlines. Traoré, forged in the dust and sweat of his people, measured it in loyalty and service. One saw the world as a stage to dominate, the other saw it as a community to protect. One spoke in boasts, the other spoke in truths. And it was this very background, his life as a soldier, his rise as a revolutionary, his bond with the people, that gave his reply the force of history. Because when Ibrahim Traoré finally opened his mouth to speak, he was not answering for himself. He was answering for a continent. Trump wasn't finished. His first declaration, "Africa needs America," had hung in the air like a thunderclap, but now he leaned forward, savoring the silence it created. He raised his hand in a dismissive wave, as if brushing aside centuries of struggle with a flick of his wrist. "You know it's true," he pressed on, his voice carrying that familiar mix of bravado and condescension. "Without American investment, without American protection, Africa would be nothing. We've given more aid, more support, more opportunity than anyone else. Frankly, Africa owes us." The words dropped like sparks into dry grass. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably, their eyes downcast, unwilling to challenge him openly. A few, mostly his allies, nodded along, their smiles betraying an eagerness to agree. But others sat stunned, appalled that such raw arrogance could be spoken aloud in a chamber meant to honor equality among nations. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the spectrum of reactions: the tight-lipped diplomat staring at the floor, the young delegate shaking his head, the journalist scribbling furiously. Online, clips of the speech were already being posted, captions screaming disbelief. For millions watching, it felt as though Trump had torn the mask off decades of diplomacy and said plainly what many had always suspected, that respect, in his eyes, was a commodity to be bought, not a principle to be honored. And yet, in that hall, one figure remained still. Ibrahim Traoré sat upright, his posture unflinching, his expression calm. He did not fidget or whisper or exchange glances. He simply watched, eyes fixed on Trump, as though measuring every word, weighing not just the insult, but the opportunity it carried. The tension grew thicker with every sentence. Would Traoré let it pass? Would he, like so many before him, swallow the insult, and retreat behind diplomatic smiles. The room seemed to lean toward him, as though the entire world was waiting for a signal. Trump, sensing no immediate challenge, pressed harder. He jabbed a finger at the audience, his tone swelling with the arrogance of assumed victory. Africa has to understand. It needs America more than America needs Africa. That's just the truth. That's reality. And the sooner everyone accepts it, the better off we'll all be. The arrogance was complete, the condescension undeniable. Some clapped weakly, a forced applause that echoed awkwardly in the chamber. Others sat frozen, unwilling to endorse what they had just heard. The silence that followed was not the silence of agreement. It was the silence before an answer. Then, as the last ripple of applause faded, Traoré leaned forward. The camera caught the flicker in his eyes, calm, steady, but burning with fire. His hands moved toward the microphone, slow and deliberate, as though he knew the weight of what he was about to unleash. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with calm fire in his eyes, Traoré leaned into the microphone. The microphone crackled as Ibrahim Traoré drew a slow breath. The hall was silent, expectant, suspended between arrogance and answer. For a moment, he let the weight of Trump's words linger in the air. His eyes swept the room, not rushing, not flinching, commanding silence without demanding it. Then, with a voice calm but resonant, he began. "Mr. President," he said evenly, "Africa does not need America. Africa needs Africans." The simplicity of the statement cut through the air like a blade. No shouting, no theatrics, just truth spoken with unshakable conviction. The audience shifted, some gasped, some straightened in their seats. Others whispered sharply as though confirming they had heard him correctly. Trump's smirk faltered ever so slightly, his arms unfolding, his expression shifting from amusement to irritation. Traoré paused, letting the words settle before pressing forward. "For too long, others have told us who we are, what we are worth, and what we must do. For too long, we have been spoken to as children, expected to bow our heads and accept the role assigned to us. But I tell you this, Africa is not a beggar at the world's table. Africa is the table." The hall erupted in murmurs. Some delegates broke into spontaneous applause, quickly muffled by the formality of the setting, but the energy was undeniable. The cameras caught every angle, Trump shifting uncomfortably, Traoré steady as a stone. "America speaks of aid, of generosity." Traoré continued, his tone tightening with controlled intensity. "But what has aid given us? Dependency. What have loans brought us? Chains. What has intervention brought us? Conflict. And yet, despite this, our people endure, our cultures thrive, our lands feed the world. Africa does not survive because of America. Africa survives in spite of America." Another wave of applause rippled across the chamber, louder this time, harder to contain. Trump's jaw clenched, his face flushing as cameras zoomed in. He opened his mouth as if to interject, but Traoré pressed on, refusing to yield the floor. "Let us speak plainly," he said. "America needs Africa. It needs our resources, our markets, our youth, our innovation. The world needs Africa's minerals to power its technology, its soil to feed its people, its culture to inspire its future. So do not stand here and tell us that we need you. The truth is, the world is already leaning on Africa. And the sooner this truth is acknowledged, the sooner we can begin a partnership built on respect, not arrogance." Gasps. Applause. A standing ovation erupted from parts of the hall, while others sat stunned, processing the reversal. Online, within seconds, the clip began spreading. "Africa needs Africans." Hashtags appeared in real time. Hashtag Traoré versus Trump. Hashtag Africa speaks. Hashtag Dignity First. Millions shared the moment as though they had been waiting for it their entire lives. Trump attempted to laugh it off, forcing a chuckle into the microphone, but the room no longer belonged to him. The camera lingered on his faltering smile, the beads of sweat forming on his forehead, the unmistakable shift from dominance to discomfort. For once, his words had met a wall stronger than bluster, dignity. Traoré leaned forward again, voice steady, deliberate, refusing to let the energy fade. "We do not seek charity. We seek fairness. We do not ask for pity. We ask for respect. We are not the shadow of America. We are the heart of a rising world. Thunderous applause drowned the chamber. Delegates rose from their seats, clapping with force, some even pounding the tables before them. The cameras captured it all, the eruption of validation, the look of triumph in the eyes of African leaders, the mix of admiration and shock on the faces of others. And still, Traoré was not finished. He raised his hand gently, signaling for quiet. Slowly, the applause subsided, leaving once again the charged silence that only truth can create. His final words landed like a verdict. History will not remember who spoke the loudest. It will remember who stood with dignity. Africa does not need to be saved. Africa needs to be respected. And today, we say it clearly, before the world, we will never bow again. The chamber exploded. This time, there was no restraining the applause. Delegates from across continents stood shoulder to shoulder, clapping, cheering, some even shouting in affirmation. The moment was seismic, captured from every angle, destined to live forever in clips and headlines. Trump sat rigid, jaw tight, his once commanding presence diminished. He shuffled his papers, tapped his fingers, tried to mask irritation with indifference, but the cameras told the story. His smirk had vanished. The king of dominance had been dethroned, if only for a moment, by a leader half his age who spoke not with bluster, but with clarity. Online, the wildfire spread. Twitter feeds flooded with praise. Memes of Trump's stunned face alongside Traoré's words exploded across platforms. Instagram posts paired his quotes with African flags. TikTok remixes layered his declaration over triumphant music. Within minutes, #AfricaNeedsAfricans was trending across multiple continents. For Africans in the diaspora, the moment was personal. Social media filled with messages of pride. Finally, someone said it. This is the leader we've been waiting for. No more bowing. Across the globe, youth saw themselves reflected in Traoré's defiance, his dignity. For once, the narrative was theirs. And in that hall, history had been made. The mic drop was not just a clapback. It was a rupture, a declaration, a shift in how the world would remember this moment. The crowd's roar still lingered when Traoré leaned back in his seat, calm, collected, almost serene, as though he had merely spoken truth, not unleashed a storm. Trump glanced sideways, lips pursed, eyes darting, unable to reclaim the stage. The battle of words was over, but the shockwaves of that moment were only beginning, because outside those walls, the world was already erupting, and the ripples would touch far more than just America and Africa. The roar of the chamber had barely faded when the moment escaped its walls and raced across the world. Within minutes, clips of Traoré's rebuttal flooded social media timelines. The line, Africa needs Africans, was replayed, subtitled, remixed, set to music, and stamped onto memes. One image showed Trump's stunned face frozen mid-grimace, paired with bold text, when arrogance meets dignity. Another turned Traoré's words into a rallying cry, #AfricaNeedsAfricans. Twitter burned with commentary. Young Africans in Lagos, Nairobi, Dakar, and Johannesburg typed furiously, posting with pride, he said what we've been waiting to hear our whole lives. Diaspora voices echoed the sentiment. Finally, someone stood up and told the truth to power. The hashtag trended across continents, rivaling celebrity gossip and breaking news. On Instagram, designers created artwork of Traoré in military uniform, eyes blazing, his words emblazoned as though they were scripture. TikTok exploded with short videos, some celebratory dances synced to his speech, others satirical parodies of Trump's fumbling expression. But it wasn't only the youth who reacted. News anchors quickly seized on the clash. CNN replayed the exchange with panels debating its significance. Al Jazeera described it as a seismic moment in the balance of global dignity. African commentators went further, calling it a turning point, a declaration of independence spoken in the heart of the world stage, and the day Africa stopped bowing. Newspapers splashed the headline across their front pages. Traoré silences Trump. In capitals across Africa, leaders and activists spoke out. Some praised Traoré for articulating what many had long believed, but never dared to say so bluntly. Others cautioned that his words must be matched with action. Yet, even critics admitted, the symbolism was undeniable. This was no longer the old script of polite diplomacy, where insults were swallowed behind closed doors. This was a new Africa, unapologetic, unafraid, and unbowed. The ripple effect stretched further still. In Latin America, commentators drew parallels to their own histories of being lectured and diminished by Western powers. In Asia, voices praised the courage of a leader half the age of most presidents, standing toe-to-toe with one of the world's loudest figures. Across Europe, younger activists seized on the moment to call for a re-evaluation of how the West treats the global South. Meanwhile, in the United States, reactions split down familiar lines. Trump loyalists dismissed the exchange as grandstanding, brushing off Traoré's words as irrelevant. But even among Americans critical of Trump, there was recognition that something profound had happened. Editorials framed it as the day arrogance backfired. Commentators on progressive networks said aloud what millions were thinking, that Trump had underestimated not only a man, but an entire continent. For Africans, the moment transcended politics. It became a matter of identity, of pride, of finally seeing themselves not through the lens of dependency, but through the power of defiance. In classrooms, students debated the meaning of dignity. In markets, traders replayed the video on their phones. In villages, elders nodded knowingly, as though this truth had always lived in their bones, waiting for someone to voice it to the world. What began as a single statement of arrogance had become a global spectacle. What was meant as a reminder of dominance had turned into a symbol of resistance. And yet, even with the headlines, the memes, the hashtags, and the applause, the story was far from finished, because the true impact of this reply went far beyond one debate. In the end, what lingered was not Trump's smirk, nor the sting of his words. What endured was the quiet power of a young leader who refused to bow. Traoré's reply was not merely a clever comeback. It was the embodiment of a universal truth: dignity outlasts arrogance. When arrogance speaks, it echoes for a moment. But when dignity answers, it resonates for generations. This moment was larger than politics. It was about the oldest contest in human history, the struggle between those who dominate and those who endure. For centuries, Africa had been framed through the lens of dependency, as though its survival required permission, as though its destiny was tied to the whims of distant capitals. But in that one reply, Traoré shattered the illusion. He reminded the world that self-reliance is not just survival, it is sovereignty. That a continent rich in history, culture, and resilience does not need anyone to validate its worth. And suddenly, the story was no longer about Trump versus Traoré. It was about arrogance versus humility, dependency versus self-determination, oppression versus liberation. It was about the eternal truth that when people reclaim their voice, no empire, no insult, no smirk can silence them. For millions watching, the lesson struck deeply. In his calm but fiery words, Traoré gave people a mirror of themselves, not as victims, but as authors of their own destiny. He showed that resistance is not only in protests or revolutions, but in the courage to say, "We define who we are." This is why the moment spread like wildfire. It wasn't just Africans who felt seen. It was immigrants in America, laborers in Asia, students in Latin America, workers in Europe. Anyone who had ever been told they were less than, anyone who had been spoken down to, anyone who had been made to feel small. Suddenly, they saw themselves standing at that microphone. And so, the clash became more than a viral video. It became a parable, a declaration that a new world is rising. Not a world built on arrogance and dominance, but one built on justice, mutual respect, and unity. A world where no nation must kneel to another to be recognized. A world where dignity is not granted, but claimed. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Never confuse dependency with partnership. Never mistake arrogance for strength. Never underestimate the quiet power of those who have endured. Because history does not bend forever in the same direction. Sooner or later, the voices once silenced rise in unison, and when they do, they cannot be ignored. In that chamber, the clash seemed like a debate between two men. But to those who watched, it felt like a prophecy. The old order, loud, dismissive, arrogant, looked smaller than ever. The new order, young, defiant, principled, stood taller than anyone had expected. And for the audience who carried those words with them, the moral was clear. Dignity is the truest power. It cannot be bought. It cannot be mocked. It cannot be erased. It waits patiently, and when it speaks, it changes the world.